Our epistle reading for June the 14th, 2026 comes from Romans chapter 5, 1 through 8. I must admit that when I wrote this commentary, it was before my wife's passing. During and immediately following her death, I found these words to ring truer in a different dimension that I had not thought of before. I mean, Paul makes logical sense that it is through suffering that we learn to endure. Anybody who has ever done any type of athletics where your muscles begin to burn and you learn to push through that. I learned that when I rode a bike for 50 miles, when I swam, when I hiked in the Rocky Mountains with a 100-pound backpack. There's a point when you just want to give up. The pain is intense, but you keep going through the pain, and then you find endurance. You find that you're more than you thought you were. There's a depth there that keeps you going. And so endurance produces character, so that the next time you encounter something difficult, you don't give up so easily, but you've learned the depth of that reserve. Some would say that's the disadvantage of participation ribbons and things like that. It's only when we push ourselves and find out what we're made of that character begins to develop. This is especially true when what we're relying on is not our muscles or our brain or our emotions or our physicality, but our faith. When our faith is tested, when we can't see a way ahead, when all things seem to fall away, as it did for me after my wife passed. It felt like there was no ground under my feet. I literally felt like I was in free fall. You've experienced this too, to varying degrees, where it makes no sense to have faith. Seems like all things are lost. And yet when we hold on to our faith, for faith is the hope of things not seen. When we hold on to that faith, then we find that we were actually just going through a tunnel. And that light does appear. A brilliant light, a bright light. A light that we could not expect. So the next time that life throws a curveball at us, next time when it seems like all is lost, we don't panic, we don't flee, we don't start worrying about things. We've learned that if we wait, if we hold on to our faith, then God's grace is sufficient. I think about my dad's generation. He was born 3 years before the Depression began. So he spent his entire life as a youth and a child in the Depression. He learned that you don't always get what you want. Sometimes you don't even get what you need. But you keep going through it. And then the war happened, and he joined, and he went into the Pacific. and he saw the horrors of war. That forging what's been called the greatest generation. What that meant for me was that when news occurred, when it seemed like the world was falling apart, when there were things that we faced in our family, in our town, and in our nation, my dad would just say, "It's going to be okay, we'll get through it." Because he had gotten through it before. The suffering allowed him to tap into endurance. And that endurance produced a character of calmness. Produced a sense of certainty when all the world seemed uncertain. And that character produced hope that it would be okay in the end. And that hope never disappointed. But I said that all this in the first commentary I had before my wife's death, before it went even deeper. Some people were surprised at my reaction. I held 2 services, one at her church and one in my church, that Sunday, the day after her funeral. I kept going. And there with my teenage daughters, we kept moving forward. Needs must, and so we dealt with the needs that we had. But I had that depth because of all the years I had walked by faith with my wife. And at first, because of her, for she had a deeper faith than I did when we first met. And I learned that deep faith that it will work out. And I learned to endure no matter what we experienced. The loss of a job, a miscarriage, falling into debt, not knowing what was next, moving to places where we didn't want to go. And in each situation, God's grace was sufficient. And so when that happened to me, I understood that God's grace was sufficient. That her suffering had ended. And what she had hoped for was now realized for her. But I also experienced something else. And that was compassion. A much deeper compassion for those in the midst of suffering. For those in the midst of the darkness and the depression. It was no longer about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It was about being present. Just to be present. Each person has to find that depth of faith that produces endurance. But while they struggle to find that depth, they don't have to be alone. They don't have to go it alone. The week after my wife's passing, a minister called me up and he says, "You're going to lunch with me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He didn't want me to be alone. The compassion we have because we've gone through it is a compassion forged by faith. Jesus' faith went all the way to the Garden of Gethsemane, to facing a brutal and savage death. I am sure that Jesus was ready to go back home to see his Father. But none of us want to face that amount of pain and torture and agony. For rarely does one die for a friend, much less a stranger. And yet Jesus did that for us. Jesus entered in to ultimate agony and suffering of torture, ridicule, emotional, mental, physical suffering. So that when we enter suffering, we know we have one who walks with us and understands. Just as I now understand more deeply the loss that can occur in a life, Jesus understands us. And so we have faith. We have faith in Jesus. We have faith in God. And we are justified. We are made closer in line with. Because we're not alone. Because God is with us. Even during the trials and the tribulations we experience. And that Holy Spirit, that feeling of amazing grace, never leaves us or abandons us, but prays for us when our words, our thoughts, and our strength fail us. The Holy Spirit intercedes for us. And that proves God's love for us.